as well, and it's actually an extension of a request that we've mentioned many times. I've mentioned to you James and Aaron Coates. As I watched some news this week, he's not the only pastor in Canada that has been arrested. He's not the only pastor in Canada that has been ticketed. That's continuing this week. It's continuing to increase in our free neighbors to the north. So we're seeing these societal restrictions come even closer, and I'm not going to mention all the names because I don't agree with all of the tactics that have been applied by or employed by these different ministers and preachers, but I'll just mention those to you, and you can go look them up. Their accounts are online, and you can see the news, and you can see what's happening, and these are the times we live in. So Daniel chapter number 8. I'll mention this note when we get ready to read. From Daniel chapter number 8 forward, the remainder of Daniel is no longer in Aramaic. Most of what has preceded has been in Aramaic, and now from this point on, the remainder of the book has gone back to Daniel's native tongue of Hebrew, and he's switched back from Aramaic because previously the Aramaic was used because he was fluent in both, obviously, but it was used in the preceding chapters because the prophecies and the history were primarily regarding and they were written to the Gentile nations. And from this point on, Hebrew is used because this message is for God's people, and it is directly referring to the Jews and Jerusalem. It's referring to the sanctuary and the coming Roman emperor that is going to persecute God's people. So understand that we're reading this in English, but from the beginning here of chapter 8 moving forward, Daniel has now begun writing in Hebrew because he's writing to God's people. Daniel chapter number 8. This is, of course, the vision, Daniel's vision of the ram and the he-goat. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, even unto me, Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. I saw in a vision, and it came to pass, when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in a vision, and I was by the river of Ulai. Then I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will, and became great. And as I was considering, behold, a he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes, and he came up to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, brake his 2 horns, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground, and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great toward the south, and toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. And it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down, and a host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? He said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. It came to pass when even I, Daniel, had seen the visions and sought for the meaning, then behold, there stood before me as the appearance of a man, and I heard a man's voice between the banks of Ulai, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell upon my face. But he said to me, Understand, O son of man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. Now as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep on my face towards the ground. But he touched me and set me upright, and he said, Behold, I will make thee know what shall be in the last end of the indignation, for at the time appointed the end shall be. The ram which thou sawest having two horns are the kings of Media and Persia, and the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now that being broken, whereas four stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. And in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power, and he shall destroy wonderfully, and shall prosper and practice, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. And through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand. He shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand. And the vision of the evening and the morning which was told is true, wherefore shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick certain days. Afterward I rose up and did the king's business, and I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it. Notice here when we begin reading this chapter that Daniel gives us a very specific time in which the vision takes place. It is the 3rd year of Belshazzar. And so we know that this is 2 years after the vision that he's had of the 4 wild beasts that he records in the previous chapter. In Daniel chapter 7, he says it's the 1st year of Belshazzar. Now he says it's the 3rd year of Belshazzar. So it's about 2 years later. And so this vision, we understand from the timeline, if you put your history together, this vision occurs the same year as the fall of Babylon. But it happens before the fall of Babylon within the same year. And that's how Daniel understands this vision. It may have been why, in fact, that Daniel was not at the feast of Belshazzar. He may have been, elsewhere. He may have been off on the king's business, but he was certainly had already received this vision, and so it was helpful for him in interpreting Belshazzar's dream. In chapter 5. Remember that chapter 7 and chapter 8 happened before chapter 5, and this chapter 8 happens immediately before chapter 5. And so Daniel has just received this information, and so this information helps him to interpret the dream of the writing of the man's hand in chapter 5 when Belshazzar had this vision. Think of this also, if you will. When you read through the prophet Isaiah's vision reveal for us Christ as the coming Messiah. When we read through Daniel, much of Daniel's writing reveals for us the coming of Antichrist. Isaiah talks about the coming of Christ. Daniel talks about the coming of Antichrist. The place where Daniel is writing, of course, is in Babylon. He's received this vision from Babylon, but he tells us that in this vision, it came to pass that I was at Shushan in the palace. Very interesting, isn't it? He was transported to Shushan, which is in the province of Elam. Shushan is a province that was at the time under the domain, it was under the rule of Babylon, but it very soon became the capital of Persia. And so that's a very big clue as to Daniel as to who's getting ready to take over as world empires, okay? And so if you want to break this chapter up, he sees the vision of the ram in verses 3 and 4. He sees the vision of the he-goat in verses 5 through 7. We see the 4 horns mentioned again in verse 8. And then you see the little horn with some descriptions of the little horn in verses 9 through 12. And, of course, These are further descriptions of what we've already learned from chapter 7. But he doesn't understand that. And so it came to pass when he had seen the vision that he's observing two saints, it says here, I believe they're angels, and he's observing this angelic conversation. And in verse 13 and 14, he sees this conversation taking place, and this one asks the other, when will this vision come to place, or come to pass? And he tells him, this little horn will come to take away the daily sacrifice, and the temple will be cast down and be desolated. This is verse number 11. How long will this be? Verse number 14 gives us that answer. 2,300 days. Until 2,300 days. And this phrase here literally means that it's evenings and mornings. It's a literal day. It's the 2,300 days. It's written in the Hebrew as being evenings and mornings, and so we understand it to be a literal day. It's not a figure. It's not one of those vision things. It's an understanding of being literally 2,300 days, and so it appears then that this is one of the difficulties of interpretation, because these 2,300 days then would start in the middle of Daniel's 70th week. And we're going to talk about that in a couple of chapters, okay? So hang on to that. I'll give you a couple other points here. They would overrun, or they would outlast the end of that week by just over 1,000 days. So it appears that the temple services would not be reestablished until Ezekiel's temple was rebuilt. Those are all problems for interpretation. Let's see what we can do with them. Verse 15. We have an interpreter that comes. Of course, this is Gabriel. All of these discussions here, when he sees these two saints talking back and forth, and Gabriel is sent to make him understand, all of these discussions are to help Daniel understand this very troubling vision that he's been given. And the interpreter, we're actually given his name. He said, I heard the voice of a man between the banks of Ulai, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. And so Gabriel, the archangel, is given instruction. He's given direction to come and make Daniel understand what it is that he has seen in this vision. Part of the difficulty here is whether or not this little horn of the terrible and horrible beast that we read in the previous chapter, Daniel chapter 7, is that the same as the little horn here of the he-goat? That seems to be at this point in time, that's the only thing that we have that's common. There's a little horn on a he-goat, and there's a little horn on this terrible, horrible beast that he's seen in chapter 7. And Daniel is trying to reconcile this. He doesn't know yet that these are coincidental dreams, and they're giving him details of the same information. And so I'll tell you this, I think it is. Others think it's not. I'll tell you why in a little bit. Each of these visions is given to bring additional detail to the visions that have gone on before. Remember this. Nebuchadnezzar's statue, the vision of Nebuchadnezzar's statue, gave an outline of the coming kingdoms. The four beasts of chapter 7, the beast kingdoms, it's an outline of the coming kingdoms. And now we have the ram and the he-goat. Again, additional details about two of these coming kingdoms. And so the angel here says, come near, or he came to Daniel, and Daniel here is afraid, and he falls on his face, and he says, understand, O son of man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. And so he gives him a specific reference as to what this visions pertain to. And these verses, 17 through 19, clearly then describe the time of the end, which he further describes on down there a couple of verses with a couple of other phrases He calls it the last end of the indignation, and he calls it the time of the end. So, the statement there is a reference to the end. Is that the end of the captivity, or is it the end of the Gentile age? I'm just going to throw this out in passing. Most scholars believe that is the end of the Gentile age, and therefore this is a prophecy of the end of time as we think of it. If you're amillennial, you believe this is the end of the captivity, and therefore it has its ultimate fulfillment in a man named Antiochus that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. I'll tell you now, and I'll give the ending away before we start. I believe it has dual fulfillment. And so this statement is a reference to both of them. I'll say that the direct reference is to a man named Antiochus, who comes out of one of the parts of this third beast, which is the he-goat, while the ultimate reference is to the end of the Gentile age, the end of time, in the person that we know as the future Antichrist. Daniel then, in verse 26, is told to shut up this vision, to bind it up, to keep it within himself, since it would not be fulfilled for a period of time, he says, for many days. And it did not apply until the end of time. And so this is the same end time of all of the visions, all of the dreams of the book. And that's why I think there's more than one application for this. So let's talk about the interpretation. I know that's what y'all are wanting to get to, right? Verse 20. Gabriel comes, and now he just point blank tells him, these beasts you're seeing, not only are they world powers that come to pass, but here's who they are, and he calls them by name, right? A succession of world powers. From Nebuchadnezzar's image, if you go all the way back and you remember the image of this colossal statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw, Daniel has learned that there are going to be 4 worldwide empires, and those 4 worldwide empires are going to be successors of each other. Each of these is going to be represented by the metals of that image. However, Daniel was not given the names of any of those empires, with one exception. Back in chapter number 2, if you're taking notes, write down chapter 2, verse number 38, when Daniel said, "Thou art this head of gold." He looked to Nebuchadnezzar and he said, "Thou art this head of gold." And so we know that the head of that colossal image represented the Babylonian Empire. 62 years later, Daniel receives this vision of 4 wild beasts, 4 vicious, consuming, 4 beasts which are very voracious, and they come and they conquer one another in a succession of worldwide powers. But he's not given any names. However, 2 years after that, as the text here tells us, in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar, he's given this vision of a ram and a he-goat. And now the angel tells him the names of the coming empires. No more questions, right? This information was withheld until the time had come for the fall of the Babylonian Empire. I mean, all Daniel really needed to understand was that the head was Nebuchadnezzar. It was Babylon. He didn't need to know any other information until it was time for the head to transpire into the silver, right? Until the beast representing Babylon was ready to transfer to the beast that represented the bear, Medo-Persia, right? And so this information was withheld until the time had come for the fall of Babylon, and then at this time he's given the names of these coming empires. And Daniel understands then, here in verse number 20, the ram which thou sawest, having 2 horns, are the kings of Media and Persia. It's the Medo-Persian Empire. The Medes and Persians at this time, in the 3rd year of Belshazzar, where are they? We know, we studied this, right? We studied this several chapters ago. The Medes and Persians were outside the city walls. They were sieging the city. Guess what? This wasn't a long stretch of the imagination for Daniel to understand that the next coming empire is probably the guys that are out there. Wait a minute. The river's going dry. Just out of sight, just over the horizon, these are the guys that had channeled the river to go outside the city and drop in the stop logs, and now the Euphrates that ran through Babylon is dry. This is the armies that are waiting just outside the city walls. The Medes and the Persians were besieging the city at the time Daniel received, or shortly after the time Daniel received this vision. Daniel, it's interesting to me, remember that Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, he receives these visions shortly before Daniel chapter 5. And so imagine this, when King Belshazzar calls Daniel in to read the handwriting on the wall. Remember when we preached Daniel chapter 5 and I said, remember this day? Why is it you think Belshazzar said, art thou that Daniel of the captivity of Judah? Yep, that's me. And I can read that. And that's how I know that this one is the Persians. And he can tell them that this is the interpretation of the dream. He had all this information when he was called to Belshazzar to interpret this writing on the wall. This is the period of time he doesn't have to ask to have a prayer meeting with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He doesn't have to ask to go spend the night in prayer and fasting. He doesn't need to consult any further. The armies are already outside of the gates, and he already knows from having two visions exactly who the kingdom is going to fall and who's going to take over. It's the Medes and the Persians. And by the way, that's God's word. That's God's will, and you can't stop it. All he had to do was speak the will of God. And so these nations are revealed. In Daniel's vision of the ram and the he-goat, we see here in verse 20, the ram which thou sawest having two horns are the kings of Media and Persia, and the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. And now that horn, that first king being broken, whereas four stood up for it, four kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his, the first king, the little horn's power. And so these nations are revealed. And now at this point, Daniel can go back to his previous vision, and he can go back to the statue that he interpreted the vision of Nebuchadnezzar, and he can start assigning names to the metals, and he can start assigning names to these beasts. And he can figure out the character, and he can figure out the details of what he's been revealed here. And so in Daniel's vision of the four wild beasts, Medo-Persia is the bear, and Greece is represented by the leopard. And so he now knows that the character of the bear and the character of the leopard applies to what we know as the Medo-Persians and the Grecians. In this vision, these empires are represented by the ram and the goat. Here's some historical facts for you. The emblem of Persia, anybody want to take a wild guess? A ram. Coins have been found from Persia with a ram's head on one side and a ram resting in repose on the other side. The Persian kings were known to ride in front of their army wearing the golden figure of a ram's head. The emblem of Greece. You know this one, right? Macedonia. The emblem of Greece is a goat. A goat has been found on Greek coins. The Aegea is an ancient capital of Greece, and it is, in Greek, Goat City. The Aegean Sea is the waters right next to that city. The Aegean Sea is the Sea of Goats. The son of Alexander was called Aegus, Aegus, which means the son of a goat. Alexander was called a goat. No surprise who these nations represent then, is it? So there's a closer comparison that we can make, and it confirms this national identity that is represented by these visions. And now, at this point, Daniel clearly understands that the ram and the he-goat represent these two nations of Medo-Persia and Greece. And so he can go back and he can apply these characters to the vision that he saw in chapter 7. He can go back and apply these characters to the metals in the vision of this colossal statue that we saw and learned of in chapter 2. Let's do that. Medo-Persia. We go back and we read about the bear in chapter 7. We didn't do this last week, but in chapter 7, the Medo-Persian bear corresponds to the higher horn of the ram. Persia was more influential than Media. And remember, the bear had one shoulder higher and the ram has one horn that's higher. One nation is stronger than the other one. Easy to figure out. There was 3 ribs in the bear's mouth. That was 3 nations that were crushed by the bear. Here in chapter 8, Daniel tells us that the ram comes and he pushes westward and northward and southward. And that ram pushes westward and he defeats Lydia, or Libya as we know it today. And he moves northward to defeat Babylon. And then he moves southward to defeat Egypt. So those 3 ribs are those 3 nations. And we understand that. Greece. We have 4 horns that come out of this goat. We had horns between the eyes of the he-goat. We have 4 heads on the leopard. They're the same thing. So the question is, what relation do these little horns of the he-goat have to each other? Well, Gabriel here tells us that the great horn between the eyes of the he-goat is the first king. And so who is the first king of Greece? We know this. Daniel may not have known him by name. We do, because we have the benefit of history. We know this man as Alexander the Great. He lived 356 to 323 BC. You remember his dad? His dad was Philip of Macedon. He became the king of Greece when he was 20 years old in 336 BC. In 334 BC, he crossed the Hellespont and he defeated the Persians with 35,000 troops. The next year, he defeated another Persian army at the Battle of Issus. 600,000 men he defeated with his 35,000, commanded by Darius. And so he moves swiftly like a leopard. He returned after a few more engagements and crossed back across the Tigris River, and he defeated Darius at the Battle of Arbela in 331 BC. He spends a few final years attempting to consolidate the outlying provinces of the Persian Empire, and then he returns to the town of Babylon. Alexander, it is said, united east and west. At this point in time, there was a Near Oriental or an Eastern Oriental culture that was threatening to overrun and to eliminate Western culture. But because of Alexander and his conquering of the known world, this Oriental culture that was trying to eliminate Western culture was finally extirpated. It was finally put down. And this rebellion, or this thrust of Eastern culture, it was put down. And I mention this only because it was said that Alexander the Great united East and West, and he finally united East and West on a single day when there was 9,000 of his soldiers that married Eastern women in a single mass wedding. on one day. I thought you'd get a kick out of that. He died in 323 BC. He died in Babylon of marsh fever and drunkenness at the age of 33. His biggest regret was that there were no more nations to conquer. By conquering all the known world, it is said that Alexander the Great brought the common language. Common in Greek is the word koine. That's where we get the term the Koine Greek. He brought the Koine Greek to the masses. The entire world spoke Greek, which is why he prepared the way for all of the world to speak a common language, which is why your New Testament is written primarily in Greek, which very shortly after it was written, that language became, I would not say a dead language, it became a preserved language, and no one speaks that Koine Greek anymore. There's still Greek that is spoken, but it's not exactly the same as that Koine New Testament type Greek, and so it's not changing. It's not continuously evolving, and we can study the original languages that have the autographs in them. All that was free. And aside, after the death of Alexander, the kingdom was divided. There was a great struggle and there was a conspiracy about who would be his successor. He didn't have any direct descendants. He had a nephew. And this conspiracy ended by Alexander's 4 generals conspiring to divide the territory amongst themselves. Remember 4 horns that would arise from a single horn, not in their own power, but in the power of the... There you go. His general Gassander took Macedonia in the west. Lysimachus, or Lysimachus, however you like to pronounce that, took Thrace and the north. Seleucus, who formed the Seleucid Empire, took Syria and the east. And Ptolemy, the Ptolemaic Empire, took Egypt and the south. Those 4 heads of the leopard, the 4 horns of the he-goat, correspond then to the nations of Macedonia, Thrace, Syria, and Egypt, which all came out of the dividing of the Greek Empire to Alexander's 4 generals. Man, history makes it easy to interpret this stuff, and Daniel didn't have that. He knew it was Greece, but he didn't know everything that was going to come after that, right? Those 4 kingdoms then, which we know, were absorbed into the 4th worldwide empire, which was Rome. The last of those 4 kingdoms to lose their identity would be Egypt, which held on to its national identity until about 30 BC. Some important things that happened right around that time. We'll study them in a few chapters. So these 4 worldwide empires are to succeed each other, but there's going to be a break. There's going to be a gap between a couple of these empires. And so now we move into Gabriel's description of this little horn. I better look. Man, how long do y'all want to go tonight? We can probably get through it. I'll go fast. Well, we're only halfway through. Y'all want to hear about a little horn, or y'all want to go home and fellowship? I'm seeing smiles and not frowns. Okay, Gabriel's description of the little horn. Verse 23. Y'all get your hip boots on because we got some deep waters to tread. Okay? Gabriel interprets the meaning of this little horn, and he says that this little horn is to arise out of the latter time of their kingdom. And so, I have to tell you first of all that those that are amillennial interpret this particular prophecy to be completely fulfilled in a man named Antiochus Epiphanes, okay, who is one of the Seleucid kings. We'll talk about the Seleucid Empire and their battles with the Ptolemies later. However, they talk about this man named Antiochus Epiphanes. Verses 23 and 24 specifically. Thus he said, the 4th beast shall be the 4th kingdom on the earth. Let me get to the right chapter. I've been turning too many pages. This looks better. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy wonderfully, shall prosper in practice, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. And through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper. That's business. Different businesses, different crafts. He shall cause craft to prosper in his hand, and he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. Notice how he causes all of the world's... He comes to power and he destroys with peace. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand. This man named Antiochus Epiphanes, Epiphanes basically means the illustrious manifestation, and he claims to be a revelation of the gods. And you can go look him up in history books. You can look him up online. He has coins that are minted with his own features on it. And then he prints the word theos on it, which of course means God. And as time goes on and he prints more of these coins, he has more and more of the features of Zeus put onto himself. Okay? And so these coins more and more start to look like the Greek god of Zeus. And what he's doing is he is proclaiming himself as a god. And that's just one example, but there's many examples where he does stuff like this. And he has these coins minted, and then what he does is, that relates to these verses that often causes some confusion. Antiochus throws out the Jewish high priest. He basically comes in, he fires him, and then he sets up a puppet priest. And this puppet priest goes along with the rulings of this man for a short period of time, but then he rebels. And when this priest rebels, Antiochus comes in with an army of 20,000 elite soldiers. This happens in December of 168 AD. He kills most of the men of Jerusalem. And then, with most of these men killed, he takes the women and he takes the children as slaves. Did I say 168 AD? I meant BC. It happens long before Christ. Okay, I think I said the wrong thing there. So with this huge elite army, he comes in, he just ransacks Jerusalem. He takes the women and the children, he makes them slaves, and there's very, very few men that escape. Okay? And that was the point. These few men that escape, they go and they join this elite guerrilla army that is under the influence, under the command of a man named Judas Maccabeus. If you've heard of the book of the Maccabeans, they're named after this fella. Okay, they're named after his family. We don't consider them to be scripture, but they are fascinating reading. And we'll come back to that in a second. So while Antiochus comes in and he destroys Jerusalem, he takes the women and children captive. There's a few men that escapes. He then basically outlaws all part of the Jewish religion. Okay? Sacrifices are forbidden. Having a copy of the book of Moses is not just illegal. It's a capital offense. Now that's akin to our Bible. All right? If they had a copy of the book of Moses, it's a capital offense. You could be killed for that. He stopped all practices of circumcision. He stopped all obedience to the dietary laws. And so what happens then is in December of 168 BC, he destroys the Jewish altar. He replaces that with an altar to Zeus that has his own picture inscribed in it. And of course you know this, you've heard of this. He then goes in December of 168 BC, and he sacrifices a pig in the center of Jerusalem on this altar where he's built after he's destroyed the Jewish altar. Okay? Eventually, this few guerrilla warriors led by Judas Maccabeus, they've had enough. And Jerusalem is finally delivered. They've finally gone back in and purified the temple by the exploits of this man named Judas Maccabeus and his followers, this guerrilla army. And that happens in December of 165 BC. You count up the days, you'll find out that that is very, very close to the number of days that were predicted. Also, as an aside, John 10:22, when Jesus comes into Jerusalem and he says it was the time of the Feast of Dedication, it's this time of year. It is, mid-December, mid to end of December. The Jews continue to commemorate this cleansing of their temple by Judas Maccabeus every year. It's an annual celebration that they call the Feast of Lights. We don't call it the Feast of Lights anymore. They call it Hanukkah. That's the Jewish word for it. The Bible, John calls it, in John 10:22, he calls it the Feast of Dedication. What happens is after Antiochus loses control of Jerusalem, and then his small band of Jewish fighters come back in and they take Jerusalem, Antiochus, 2 years later, he basically can't hold Jerusalem anymore, and so he runs off to Persia. He's in exile, and he literally goes crazy. I mean, he's just out of his mind, and he dies because he goes crazy, and he dies down in Persia about a year and a half later. So there's a lot of confusion about this man named Antiochus. I'm going to tell you that most of these prophetic predictions do apply to Antiochus, but he is a type of what the Antichrist will do in the last days. But I'll tell you why I don't think this applies strictly to this man, why there's another fulfillment coming, which I believe is the Antichrist. Antiochus did not live in the later times of these kingdoms. And this prophecy is very specific, that he will live in the latter times of these kingdoms. He's not the last king that they had. In fact, he is only the 8th of 26 kings that rules over the kingdom of Syria. When he dies in 164 BC, it's 134 years before the last of these 4 kingdoms disappears from the scene. And so Antiochus is part of the horn. He's part of the kings of Syria. And so if he's part of this horn, the kings of Syria, he can't also be the little horn. All right? The little horn is to be exceeding great. Antiochus was certainly very evil. He certainly did many, many things that were atrocious to the Jews in that Seleucid empire or that Seleucid nation, kingdom that he ruled over. But he never became a worldwide ruler. He never became exceeding great. He did desecrate the temple during the Maccabean revolt in 168, but he died shortly thereafter. That's not what we see here of the Antichrist in other scriptures. Here's probably the biggest proof. Matthew 24, verse 15. Jesus, speaking about the end of days, talks about the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. And he says, let him that readeth understand. When he talks about the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet, he's talking about an event still in the future at some point in time. He's not talking about something that was in the past connected with Antiochus, and Antiochus had been dead for about 200 years. And he wouldn't be talking about a future prophecy yet fulfilled if the guy he was talking about is already dead for 200 years, right? So, I believe Antiochus is a type of the Antichrist. His abomination of desolation is an indication of the types of things that the Antichrist will do in the last times. And so that's why I say I believe there's a dual fulfillment here. Antiochus is the immediate fulfillment. This is what's coming at the time of the end of this rule. And yet, there is an ultimate fulfillment, a complete fulfillment in what we know as the future Antichrist. And so, that brings us to the little horn. Hang with me, I'll talk fast. Okay? These descriptions are progressive. Each one adds new details to the preceding descriptions. So in Daniel chapter 7, what have we learned about the little horn? the little horn plucks up 3 horns, right? There's a group from the Roman Empire. There are 10 horns, 10 nations, and the little horn subdues 3 of those, right? He has eyes like a man. He has a mouth that speaks great things. And so we have learned that this little horn speaks great words, and he speaks against Christ. So this little horn seeks to change times and laws, and he will annihilate the Jews for 3.5 years. Daniel chapter 8 gives us new information about a little horn. It says here that he waxes exceeding great towards the south, the east, and the pleasant land. That's Israel, by the way. He will cast down part of the host of heaven and stamp them with his feet. We see that here in these final verses. The daily sacrifice is taken away. He's a king of fierce countenance. He's one with great power, but not his own power. In other words, he is a superhuman. He has superhuman powers. He destroys the mighty and the holy people. His policy will cause all crafts. We mentioned this when we read through these, verse 24 and 25, and he causes all crafts, in other words, all businesses to prosper. There's going to be an economic boom under this Antichrist. He will stand up against Christ and ultimately be broken without hand. Look at verses 23 through 25. He's going to be standing up and speaking against Christ, but he's going to be broken with without hand, without man's efforts against him. Flash forward, and we'll talk about this again when we get to Daniel chapter 11. Daniel chapter 11 calls him a willful king, and Daniel chapter 11, the willful king will exalt and magnify himself above every god. He prospers until the indignation, which we know is the great tribulation that's accomplished. He doesn't regard the God of his fathers, and he will not regard the desire of women. Let's just turn there and read that because it's pretty important. Daniel chapter 11, verse 36. The willful king, or the king that magnifies himself. The king shall do according to his will, that's his willful king. He shall exalt himself, magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods. Now we know it's the Antichrist, right? Pretty specific here. It shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. For that is determined shall be done. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall magnify himself above all. But in his estate shall he honor the God of force, and a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold and silver and precious stones and pleasant things. Thus shall he do in the most stronghold with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain. Okay. We know that he prospers until the end time, which is the indignation, or what we call in the New Testament, the Great Tribulation. Until that's accomplished, he doesn't regard the God of his father, and basically that means he tries to break down every other religion. We know from Revelation there's a worldwide religion coming. He doesn't regard the desire of women. Interesting words here in the Latin translations, desiderium mulierum. It's not that which women desire. It's not saying that he doesn't regard the wishes that women have. In other words, we all try to please our wives. What she says she gets. She rules the house. It's not that sort of a thing when he's saying here the desire of women. He doesn't desire that which women possess. He doesn't regard that which makes women desirable, is what the original language means. In other words, he doesn't regard human affections, even and including the affections of women. I think the Bible's trying to be real polite here. Okay? It's a he that doesn't regard the affections of women. You get what it's saying? Okay. It doesn't necessarily mean that he's that way himself, but he's very friendly to it. Not going into a lot of depth there. Just flash back to what we talked about a couple of Sundays ago about Romans chapter 1. That is the new marching orders that are going across the land, all right now. It's just the progression of society. Again, I'm not saying that he has those perverted affections, but that's just, he's very, very friendly and accommodating towards them. So he's not regarding any God. Verse 37 there in chapter 11 doesn't even regard the God of his fathers. And so what we know here from the summary, and we're going to talk about this little horn again in chapter 11. So just a real quick summary here. The little horn arises from the 10 horns of the fourth wild beast. The fourth wild beast we know is the Roman Empire. And so this little horn, Antichrist, I believe, comes out of one of those 10 nations of the Roman Empire. Now, 4 of those 10 nations are 4 of the kingdoms into which Greece was divided. So Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt. We know that this little horn from chapter 8 comes out of one of these 4 little horns from the Greek Empire. So not only is he from one of the 10 of Rome, he's from one of the 4 of Greece, which is swallowed up into the Roman Empire. Well, we're kind of narrowing this country's down, aren't we? He will stand up against the Prince of Princes, again in chapter 8, verse 25. That will bring his transgressions, his sins to full measure. At that point, he is broken without hand. Again, the immediate fulfillment. Antiochus Epiphanes just went crazy. He lost his mind. The Antichrist, we're told in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 8, that the wicked being not wicked in general, but the wicked in 2 Thessalonians 2:8 is singular. It is Antichrist. Will be consumed with the spirit of the Lord's mouth and shall be destroyed by the brightness of his second coming. He'll be broken without hand. And so I just want to say that the Lord will destroy Antichrist personally. None of us need to plan to fight that battle. Okay? None of us need to plan to take up arms against that Antichrist. So, this chapter has a lot of information and unfortunately not a lot of application yet. However, let's read these last 2 verses. The vision of the evening and the morning which was told is true. Wherefore shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days. So the angel immediately tells him, shut up the vision. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick certain days. Afterward I rose up, did the king's business, was astonished at the vision, but none understood it. Lots of information, not a lot of application yet at this point. But when Daniel spoke to these 2 saints, and then the archangel Gabriel comes and speaks to him, I want you to notice that he felt the burden of the coming darkness. He completely understands at this point Judah's release from captivity is very near. And because it is very near, he begins to pray about it in the next chapter. We'll study that next week. And he begins a series of prayers and fastings that says the time has to be close for our deliverance. So he knows their deliverance and their release from captivity is very near. He knows their temple is going to be rebuilt. But yet, from verse number 12, a host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, cast down the truth to the ground. He knows, in spite of their release, and in spite of the temple being rebuilt, at some point in the future, God's truth is yet going to be rejected and cast underfoot. And I believe that's why in verse 27 we see him ill. That's serious. Great things are coming in the near future, but in the distant future, God's word rejected and yet cast underfoot again. But yet next week we're going to see that he still carries on and ministers to the people, and he has great joy. Second thing I see here, he was told to shut up the vision, and he fainted and was sick. And I noticed that he's in the presence of an angel, and the angel has to come and pick his face up off the ground. Not only because he's face down on the ground in front of the angel, which is not even Christ, it's just Gabriel, the archangel. And in verse 27, we see that he's fainted. When a man is given a great prophecy, he didn't go write a book. Actually, he did write a book, but he didn't write the book right away. He pondered these thoughts. He didn't presume to be so important that everyone else had to hear what he had just learned. Although everybody else probably should have heard what he had just learned. And just so I make sure you're getting what I'm trying to put out there, he wasn't trying to write a New York Times bestseller about ancient mysteries. He didn't claim that he was the new harbinger, claiming a shift in paradigm about new oracles. I'm looking at a man named Kahn. I've read a couple of his books. Interesting garbage is what it is. He didn't claim that he was going to heaven or return to heaven for some number of minutes and then come back to earth to spread rumors about his corrupted vision. Prophecy isn't given to make somebody popular. Prophecy isn't given to make someone prosperous. And prophecy isn't given to make someone a prolific writer. That's some applications that I see out of this. Daniel pondered. And in verse 27, he fainted when he saw an angel. The angel picked himself up. But when Daniel saw these things, he pondered, he prayed, and then he got himself up and he went back to work. And he didn't write a best-selling book, and he didn't go on Oprah, and he didn't go around the country signing book deals. He didn't get on TV and say, if you just have enough faith, all this money can be yours. God expects us to be diligent. God expects us to be working even when we have special revelation. We have to be about the King's business. God doesn't promise prosperity. He doesn't promise us our best life now. What he did promise was he promised to show himself faithful to those who are faithful. He promised to show mercy to those who show mercy. There's not a lot of application in here. But there's some principles we can see here that none of the men in our society seem to enact. They search some ancient mysteries and write some books that, you know, if you look at this coin and there's a chip out of this coin, you stick it in this bush and that tree grows there, then, hey, the stock market's going to crash next week. Really? I just read my Bible. I just trust God. Because whether all that stuff is true or whether it's not, I can trust God. And I can trust my Bible. And that I know for sure. So I've held you guys long enough. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your attention. I'm glad we're out of this book, or out of this chapter. We might go even faster in chapter 9.